New York City is a city of immigrants. More than 20% of the city's 8.8 million residents can trace their roots back to the Caribbean. And it's insane when you look at the Caribbean population compared to other groups in the area. Today, Dominicans are the largest immigrant group in the city, with Jamaicans not far behind in third place. Although the overall immigrant population of New York has shifted over time, the city has expanded at an incredibly fast rate from the 1960s to the present day, and much of that growth has been driven by the dramatic increase in people from the Caribbean. In fact, the first and only recognized Little Caribbean in the world is in Brooklyn, which has 560,000 Caribbeans living in the borough alone. Their diverse culture is present from the moment you arrive there. Street signs bear the names of famous figures like Bob Marley, and vibrant murals of Caribbean icons are painted across bodegas and apartment buildings. In some places, you'll be addressed in Spanish, and sometimes even greeted in Haitian Creole. After all, 30% of the immigrant population of the city speak Spanish at home, and Haitian Creole is one of the top 5 languages spoken among legal non-citizens. This highly concentrated demographic in one location is quite unique, even with America's reputation as a melting pot of different people and cultures. So how did New York City become home to the largest Caribbean diaspora in the world? Well, while it's easy to see this as a relatively recent phenomenon, the foundations of Caribbeans in the city can be traced back centuries. Back in the 17th century, enslaved people from colonies such as Barbados, Jamaica, and Antigua were among the first to be brought to North America. In fact, in 1613, a man named Juan Rodriguez from Santo Domingo became the first recorded non-indigenous person to settle in New York City, then known as New Amsterdam. But it wasn't until the end of the 18th century, during the Haitian Revolution between 1791 and 1804, that a more visible wave of Caribbean migrants arrived in the US. They were mostly white, formerly enslaved people, and free black refugees seeking safety and opportunity in America. Yet, despite New York abolishing slavery in 1827, Caribbean immigration to the city only first began to really pick up in the early part of the 20th century, triggering the start of several waves. The first was tied to the construction of the Panama Canal between 1903 and 1914, an American project that recruited more than 200,000 Afro-Caribbean laborers, primarily from Barbados and Jamaica. When the canal was completed, the job market basically collapsed, and many of these workers began looking north for new opportunities. New York, with its expanding industries and close proximity to the Caribbean states, made it a convenient destination. Among the first immigrants were Jamaicans and Bahamians looking to move away from British colonialism. As English speakers, they were often better positioned to find work and integrate into the city's predominantly black neighborhoods. By 1920, Caribbean immigrants made up a quarter of the city's black population. Around this time is also when the iconic Harlem Renaissance began. It was a wave of black cultural expression that emerged in Manhattan's Harlem neighborhood after many black Southerners moved north to escape strict Jim Crow laws. But a significant portion of Harlem's population also migrated from the West Indies, including Jamaica, Antigua, and Trinidad and Tobago, after declining sugar prices on the islands left many facing economic hardship. By 1930, nearly a quarter of those living in Harlem came from the West Indies. While most were migrating in search of better wages, there was a growing number of middle-class, professional, and educated people who were looking to establish themselves here. Among them was Jamaican activist and political leader Marcus Garvey, who used Harlem as the base for expanding his message of black self-determination into an international movement. In doing so, he helped lay the foundation that made New York City a key destination for later Caribbean migration. But Jamaicans weren't the only ones establishing themselves in the city, as changes in the US immigration law drew other Caribbean migrants to the mainland. The Jones-Shafroth Act of 1917 granted US citizenship to Puerto Ricans, encouraging migration to the mainland, and by 1920, an estimated 42,000 were living in the US. Around 7,000 of them settled in New York City, compared to just 500 a decade earlier. Meanwhile, for other Caribbeans looking to migrate to the city, things became much more challenging in June 1924 with the passage of the Johnson-Reed Immigration Act. Although the law didn't explicitly target Caribbeans, it severely restricted immigration from non-Western European countries, effectively bringing this earlier era of migration to an end. By the 1940s, the percentage of all foreign-born residents in the city had fallen to just 29%, down from 34% a decade earlier. But this decline didn't apply to everyone. As US citizens, Puerto Ricans weren't subject to the same federal immigration quotas, and as New York expanded into an industrial powerhouse within close proximity to the island, it served as a magnet for Puerto Rican workers. By 1930, more than 52,000 Puerto Ricans were living in New York City, with many of them settling in neighborhoods like El Barrio in East Harlem, the South Bronx, and Brooklyn. As economic conditions on the island grew more difficult after World War II, many Puerto Ricans who'd served in the US military found the opportunities available on the mainland more appealing and chose to remain. They were also joined by their relatives as flights between San Juan and JFK became more affordable and frequent. This was later described as the first great airborne migration in US history, and this pattern only continued after the Korean War, during which 61,000 Puerto Ricans served, including about 18,000 who enlisted on the mainland. It was during this period that more than 430,000 Puerto Ricans relocated to the continental United States in search of work and opportunity, with the majority settling in New York City. Even at this early stage, Caribbean migrants were already beginning to form neighborhoods and cultural foundations across New York City. As with many cases of immigration, new arrivals are likely to first settle in areas where similar communities already live. Neighborhoods like Harlem and Bedford-Stuyvesant acted as halfway points into the city. They were also known as soft landing zones, places where new arrivals would find jobs, housing, familiar cultures, and guidance on how to adjust to life in the US. And this foundation would become stronger and more important as a second, more substantial wave of Caribbean immigrants occurred from the late 1950s onwards. Next came the Haitians, fleeing the dictatorship of Francois Papa Doc Duvalier in 1957 and the years of brutal oppression that followed under his son in the 1970s and 80s, also choosing New York City as a destination. The majority settled in Flatbush, a neighborhood in Brooklyn where the largest Haitian community in the city still lives today. The initial recorded number of Haitian immigrants arriving in the US was just 4,816 during the 1960s. And most were living in New York City. But as political conditions deteriorated in Haiti, migration exploded between 1970 and 1980, with more than 92,000 Haitians arriving in the US, and by 1990 that number had risen to over 225,000. As the US became increasingly involved in the political affairs of the overall region, New York, with its proximity, became a magnet for other Caribbean groups. Cubans had been migrating to New York City since the late 19th century, but it was the Cuban Revolution of 1959 that triggered a major wave of migration to the US. Since these were political refugees escaping Fidel Castro's new socialist regime, the US government was at first keen to provide aid to the new arrivals and issued the Cuban Adjustment Act in 1966, making Cubans the only Latino group eligible for a green card after 1 year of living in the country. But New York City wasn't as close as Miami, and it didn't see the same explosion of Cubans migrating here. Only 14% of the Cuban-born population in the US resided in New York City in 1970, compared to Miami's Cuban expat population, which had exploded from around 10,000 to 500,000 by the end of the 1960s. During the Mariel boat lift of the early 1980s, another 125,000 Cubans arrived in the US. But by 1990, only 5.6% of Cubans chose to settle in New York City. Many bypassed the city altogether for New Jersey, particularly in Hudson, Bergen, and Union counties. Caribbean immigrants in New York had reached 500,000 by the late 1980s. But it was the assassination of Dominican dictator Rafael Trujillo in 1961 that proved to be one of the greatest catalysts in New York City's transformation. During Trujillo's 30-year regime, heavy restrictions were placed on migration, making it nearly impossible for citizens to leave. After he died, though, people were able to travel freely, and that combined with the extreme political instability that came with the fall of his regime, from the 1963 coup against the democratically elected Juan Bosch to the 1965 Civil War, and as a result, the subsequent US invasion, meant many people were fleeing en masse. New York City was the main place Dominicans went, particularly to neighborhoods such as Corona in Queens and Washington Heights in Manhattan. They were initially drawn to the city because of its already established Spanish-speaking communities, which had been formed by the Puerto Ricans already living in these areas. By 1970, around 61,000 Dominicans had arrived in New York City, and in the following decades, another 109,000 immigrated. With a solid Dominican base now established, another major wave of migration followed in the 1980s. Due to increasing economic trouble and reduced sugar exports on the island of Hispaniola, an island they share with Haiti, many Dominicans boarded ships for the US. Between 1980 and 2000, the US Dominican population grew by more than 500,000, including over two-thirds of them living in New York City alone. Most were able to settle in the city thanks to the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965, which prioritized family reunification and made it easier for those already living in New York to sponsor their relatives back home. To this day, almost all Dominicans obtaining permanent residence in the US do so through family ties, and they still live in places like Washington Heights, which is often called Little Dominican Republic now, and the Bronx. Then there's the Guyanese immigration to America, which increased dramatically after the independence of Guyana from the United Kingdom in 1966. An average of 6,000 people a year emigrated from Guyana between 1969 and 1976. Increasing to an average of 14,000 between 1976 and 1981 due to the turbulent times under dictator Forbes Burnham. As of 2019, the most recently available data, there are 231,000 Guyanese Americans currently living in the US, and the majority live in NYC. They mostly live in Richmond Hill and South Ozone Park. In fact, Liberty Avenue, which runs through there, was co-named Little Guyana Avenue in 2021 due to all the Guyanese cultural influence there. Finally, later political problems in nations like Jamaica and Trinidad and Tobago also prompted further immigration into what was now an already Caribbean city. In the 1980s, Jamaica was deeply impacted by gangs and political corruption. Meanwhile, in 1990, the aftermath of an attempted coup in Trinidad and Tobago prompted Trinidadians with financial resources and the means to travel to head for the relative closeness of New York City. Despite coming from such a small island nation, Trinidadians became the 8th largest immigrant group arriving in the city between 1990 and 1994. By the turn of the century, around 600,000 West Indians were living in New York, making up more than half of the city's black population. As the English-speaking Caribbeans, they were able to lower the barriers to work and education, allowing many to integrate themselves under the umbrella of the American dream. What this has all led to is New York City becoming the undeniable capital of the Caribbean diaspora. After more than 80 years of steady Caribbean immigration, it's no surprise that neighborhoods have come to be known as Little Dominican Republic or Little Guyana. In fact, as I said before, there's even a Little Caribbean, located along the commercial corridors of Flatbush Avenue, Church Avenue, Nostrand Avenue, and Utica Avenue, featuring the largest, most diverse Caribbean American community outside the West Indies. Today, among the city's biggest annual celebrations is the West Indian Day Parade, one of the largest Caribbean festivals outside the region and a testament to the Caribbean community's influence on New York. But things may slowly be changing. Today, New York still remains home to the largest total number of Caribbean immigrants. However, Miami has overtaken it in both concentration and growth rate of Caribbean-born residents, making it now the leading destination by proportion of population. They already have their own Little Havana, Little Haiti, and Little Santo Domingo, on top of having the nickname as the capital of Latin America. But even as the Caribbean communities expand beyond New York, the city remains the symbolic and cultural heart of the diaspora. Thank you for watching.